Hi, I'm David Taub, and welcome to the Parshah Rabbit Hole, where I find something weird in the weekly Torah portion and follow it all the way down until it gets even weirder. This week's rabbit hole eventually gets us to giants, babies, and baby giants.
Maggie will always be my giant baby.
But, as always, we have to get there. This week's Torah portion, Parshah Chukas, has a lot of interesting stuff in it, but towards the end, there's a part about some battles that the Israelites fought and won, and one of the enemies that they encountered was Og, the king of Bashan. Now, the Torah doesn't mention anything about Og's size here, but Og is a giant.
A giant? Oh, joy!
A giant?
A giant!
His size is mentioned later on in Devarim, or Deuteronomy, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But the really exciting stuff about Og is in Midrashim and in the Talmud. In fact, for those of you who know Og from these Midrashim, where he pops up in almost every major event in Torah, you might be surprised that this is actually the first time that he's mentioned. Anyways, our Parsha doesn't go into the details of how he was defeated, just that Hashem told Moshe not to be afraid of him, and then they defeated him. But the Talmud gives us some more details. The whole story there is very exciting, and if you haven't heard it before, I suggest that you take a look. But I'm just going to focus on the end of the Talmud's account of this event. It says that Moshe was 10 amos tall, he had an axe that was 10 amos tall, and jumped up 10 amos, and struck Og in the ankle and killed him. For those of you who weren't really into the math rabbit holes that I've done a couple of times, don't worry, that's not where I'm going. I am interested in measurements here, but not in a mathy way. Something I've always been fascinated by is how the measurements in Torah have a little bit of ambiguity baked into them. They're all based on real-world things that vary in size, and some of them even have the word like built into the word. For example, a kezias is like an olive. So as somebody who struggles with structure and loves infinite possibilities, I've always been fascinated by a kind of tension that I perceive in halacha, in Jewish law, created between the ambiguity of these measurements and the need for precise definitions in order to follow all the laws correctly.
300 cubits, give or take.
Exactly 300.
And that relative subjective aspect of measurements gets particularly highlighted when we're talking about things that are outside of the norm, like giants. So that's where this week's rabbit hole starts, with Og the giant and how he challenges our system of measurement. If you're ready to see where that leads, let's dive in. Alright, let's start with Og's ankle, which according to the Gemara that we looked at earlier, is 30 amos high. An amma is a biblical measurement based on the length from the tip of the middle finger to the elbow. A commonly accepted conversion into modern measurements is about 19 inches, or just over 1.5 feet. So Moshe was 15 feet tall, which is cool on its own. He jumped up 15 feet, which is very impressive. And he had a 15-foot axe, which is scary. In total, that's 45 feet just to Og's ankle. But an interesting thing happens with these measurements when we start talking about things with non-normative sizes. All of those measurements, even with their built-in ambiguity, usually give us at least a ballpark range. We know how big olives and arms are, generally. But when we start talking about abnormally large things or people, we end up with the question of whether we're still using average sizes, or if now we've switched into measuring in giant sizes.
He-fi-fo-hum, he-hi-ho-hum.
For example, there's another Gemara that establishes that Moshe Rabbeinu was 10 amos tall, which, by the way, is really tall. It says that he installed the top of the Mishkan, the portable temple that was used in the desert, and therefore he must have been at least as tall as the Mishkan, which was 10 amos tall. Now the Gemara doesn't ask why it couldn't just be that someone used a ladder. Instead, Rav Shimi Bar Chia says, hey, if he was 10 amos tall, then you're saying that Moshe Rabbeinu had a deformity. And the Gemara references a list of physical abnormalities that render a kohen unfit for service in the temple. One of those is if his body is disproportionately large compared to his limbs. So, by the way, the whole idea of that list is strange to me, and it's definitely worth further exploration, especially because most of them very clearly wouldn't limit the kohen's physical ability to do the sacrifice stuff. Maybe I'll get a chance to look at that more in a future rabbit hole. But what's relevant here is that Rav Shimi assumes that we're not talking about standard amos anymore. We're talking about Moshe's amos, his personal amos, the measurement from his tip of his finger to his forearm. Rashi gives us some background on why that would be considered a deformity. He says that generally people are only 3 times the length of their own forearm. I saw other places that say 4, which is what I got when I measured my own forearm compared to the rest of my body. You can go ahead and pause the video now if you want to go give that a try. Okay, anyways, then Rav answers Rav Shimi that we're not talking about Moshe's personal Amos, we're talking about the standard Amos used for the Mishkan. Okay, so before I continue, I felt a little bit uneasy about using the word deformity here. If there's a better word to use, please educate me in the comments. This isn't engagement farming, I genuinely want to know. So what's interesting about this to me is how once we started talking about something that was outside of the average, it kind of broke our assumptions about measurements, and it made us have to deal with whether we're talking about standard measurements still, or whether we're now talking about relative measurements. And when we do start thinking about relative measurements, then we get some visually interesting possibilities.
He's like a big square, this guy.
And this actually happens with a verse about Oig that shows up later in Devarim when it's reviewing the events that happened in this week's Parsha. I actually didn't even know this verse existed. Somehow I managed to miss it every year, even though it's fascinating. But when I was trying to figure out what to look into for this week's episode, some friends suggested, how about Oig's bed? And I was like, Oig's bed, what? And then they showed me this verse. It says, Oig's bed was made of iron, and that it was 9 amos long and 4 amos wide, but amos ish in the cubits of man. And the verse also gives a possible location for where this bed is. Okay, so I don't know how I never paid attention to this. It has so much weirdness in it. First of all, just the seemingly completely random mention of Oig's bed is fascinating. And of course the idea of a possible location is exciting to me, like with the trumpets a few weeks ago. But the part that's relevant to our rabbit hole is the measurements. It says that his bed was 9 amos long, which would be around 14 feet, which would certainly be a very big bed for a very large man. But according to the Gemara that we looked at earlier, that giant bed wouldn't even fit Oig's foot. Rambam in his Guide for the Perplexed doesn't have a problem with that. He likes these measurements. He explains that since a bed is usually bigger than the person who sleeps in it, a 9 amos long bed would make Oig around 6 amos tall, or around 10 feet, which Rambam says is 2 times the height of an average person, which according to him is tall enough to be extraordinary, but not so tall that it's impossible.
They will illustrate the principle in animation, which we call the plausible impossible.
Rashi, on the other hand, does seem to be bothered by this. It's not big enough to fit with the supergiant size implied in the Gemara, and he solves this problem by focusing on the words ba'amis ish, in the amos of man. He says that doesn't mean the amos of an average man, it means the amos of that particular man, Oig amos. So now we're doing the relative proportions thing. And one of the fun things about doing this, besides for the arm-to-body ratios getting interesting, is that it gets kind of loopy. The only way for Oig amos to solve the problem is if Oig amos are big, but we don't know how big Oig is because we're measuring him in Oig amos. So it goes around in circles. Ibn Ezra brings up both of these issues, and rejects the idea that we're using Oig amos here. He says that we're talking about standard amos, which would make him double the size of an average person, so that's like Rambam. And then he says that Oig amos doesn't make sense, because then the Torah isn't giving us any information. We still don't know how tall he is. And then he adds, furthermore, if you do that, then Oig no longer has the form of a person. The notes in the English translation of Ibn Ezra on Safaria said that this thing about not having the form of a person means that he would be unrealistically large, which would be impossible. So it's a rationalist problem with giants. But that doesn't make sense with the first part where he says that if we use Oig amos, we actually wouldn't know how tall he is at all. So I dug around and I found a bunch of different places that explain it, like the question in the Gemara that we looked at earlier about arm-to-body ratio, and that makes a lot more sense to me. Mizrahi brings up Ibn Ezra's question, and it seems to me that he answers it with the second part of the question. He says that maybe the new information that the Torah is giving us is that Oig had an extraordinary body shape. He says that usually a person's height is 4 times the length of their own forearm, like it was with me. And he goes on and says, assuming that Oig's bed was a little bit longer than he was, that would make him 8 times the length of his own forearm, which would be an unusually long body compared to his arms. But the Maharal of Prague points out an issue with this logic. If we're dealing with Oig amos, then nothing has a predefined measurement, so that ratio of 8 to 1 could swing the other way. The Maharal says, according to that logic, maybe he didn't have a very long body, maybe he had very short arms.
You know, I don't often let people in on this, but there was one time in my life when I had short little stubby arms.
And then he gives his own answer, which is that when Rashi says that Amos Ish, the Amos of man, means Oig Amos, he means that the verse is telling us that Oig Amos are the standard units of measurement for giants, because he was the biggest one. In which case, the verse may not be giving us clear information about the size of Oig, but it is giving us cool new information about giant culture. Okay, so far we've had two different ways of dealing with the discrepancy between the Midrash telling us about Oig's 45-foot ankle and this verse telling us about his 14-foot bed. We've got Rambam and Ibn Ezra seemingly ignoring the Midrash and saying that twice the size of an average person is plenty big. And we've got Rashi saying that we're using giant measurements and not standard measurements. But Rashbam, as well as some other commentaries, offer another way of solving this problem. He says that this bed wasn't just a bed, it was the crib that Oig used as a baby. So according to this approach, we're using standard Amos, and the verse is telling us that when Oig was just a teeny tiny baby, he needed a 14-foot long iron crib. So even if we take a little bit off of that so that baby Oig has room to wriggle around, that's still a 12-foot tall baby.
Well, thank you, big baby. Why don't you come meet our new friends?
I haven't done the math, but I assume it makes sense that a 12-foot tall baby could grow up to have a 45-foot high ankle. Al-Sheikh adds another dimension to this way of explaining the verse. Literally, he points out that the verse not only tells us about the length of Oig's bed, but the width of it as well, 9 amos by 4 amos. And he says that's not the usual proportions of an adult, to only be a little bit taller than 2 times their width. But he says that is usual for babies, so therefore it must be talking about baby Oig's baby bed. Okay, so we've seen some ways that the standard units of halachic measurement get challenged when we're talking about giants. But sometimes that's done on purpose. There are a bunch of places in Gemara where they bring up Oig specifically to challenge a one-size-fits-all approach to a given halachic measurement,
leading to anarchy of biblical proportions.
And the reason that I know about this is because a few years ago I had a question that I would ask rabbis in shul when I was bored, which is that since the minimum required size of a sukkah is based on the size of a human body, then if a person was hit by a shrink ray and shrunk down to a tiny size, would they still be required to use a regular size sukkah, or could they use a tiny sukkah? Different rabbis gave me different answers, and eventually I got bored and moved on to a question about teleporting on Shabbos, which I got into a little bit in a previous rabbit hole. But while I was still in the tiny shrink ray sukkah phase, I stumbled upon a Gemara about the minimum amount of food or drink that would be considered as eating or drinking on Yom Kippur, or in English, Yom Kippur. In other words, the question is, how much does it take before you get struck by lightning? That's my own wording, not the Gemara's. What the Gemara does say is that Rav Zera says that if the given amount is enough to be considered eating for a regular person, then is that same amount also enough for Oig? So this happens in a few places, and besides for the Oig connection, what I like about it is that it's an example of how the Gemara has a shorthand of extreme absurd scenarios to test out the limitations of any given idea. Another example is flying camels, which I mentioned briefly in a previous rabbit hole, but I might get into it more next week if the rabbit hole leads me where I think it's leading me. Okay, so while I was digging around for stuff about that Gemara, about the minimum amount of food that it would take to sustain Oig's life, I somehow found my way to Hasidus, Jewish mysticism. The 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe mentions Oig while explaining the Hasidic and Kabbalistic concept of Or, which literally means light, but in Kabbalistic terminology it refers to a certain type of spiritual expression. He explains that or light in Hasidus, doesn't have size, large or small. It doesn't take different amounts of or to fill up different size spiritual containers. And he used the analogy of the light of the sun, which he says can illuminate a small room exactly the same way that it illuminates a large palace. The only difference is that the physical limitations of the room itself stop the light from spreading as much as it would in a large palace. But it's the same exact light without any change. And then he says that it's the same with the light and life force of the soul. And this is where Oig comes in. He says you can't say that Oig had a large soul and a 1-year-old baby has a small soul. Rather, the soul of a baby has the ability to enliven the body of Oig. So I just love the imagery here of this silly little teeny tiny baby that can barely do anything. It's just like sitting there, baby. But inside of that teeny tiny baby is a soul that's powerful enough to animate a giant. Alright, that's it. That's the rabbit hole. As always, questions, things I missed, put it in the comments. And yeah, that is engagement farming, but it's also sincere. I really do like hearing from all of you. Thank you for following me down the rabbit hole, which this week was 100 feet deep in rabbit feet.